welcome. In our last lesson, we worked with lists and we basically saw how we could create a list of game objects that held a reference. For instance, we wrote this script that held a reference to some game objects and we printed that game object's name and also the positions of those game objects right here. If you look at the console, this is getting the names of these game objects and it's printing out their positions on the console. Right, so this time around, let's go ahead and see what prefabs are and how we can work with prefabs. So to begin, I'm just going to create a new scene. I'm going to go to File, Save Scene As, and in my Scenes folder, I'm going to call that _9. I think I might _9. Yeah, good. So we'll just say _09 _ prefabs. Alright, so we have a fresh new scene. Let's go ahead and clear our project and we can just begin. So first of all, what is a prefab and why is a prefab important? For instance, if I go ahead and go to my game object and create one empty game object, and I go to game object and I create a cube. Let's say I want maybe 10 copies of this cube. I could go to edit and I could go to duplicate. I could go to edit and duplicate this cube again. Maybe I need to create a light, so I'll go to game object, light. I'll create a let's just say a point light. So I have one point light, 3 cubes in my scene, and I also have one game object in my scene. So if I need to do this again, I could just select all these objects. I'll click once and then hold down Control and select the cube, and then go to edit and then duplicate. So I have another copy of this game object, and before you know it, my scene becomes messy. Also, this is what happens. What if when I play the scene, I actually want to instantiate this game object at another position? So before you actually know what's happening, I'm going to be actually having difficulty. What if I want to create this game object at this position each time the scene starts? Let's say I want this cube to be here. I want this cube to be here, and I also want this cube to be here. This one to be here. I'll drag this one like that, and also have my point light, and I'll just drag my point light in this scene. Right, so this is the kind of view I want to get. Also, by the way, if you want to set up your scene to be actually have that same view, let's say for instance I want my scene to be have this view like that. I want to have this view. I could just select the main camera and go to game object and go to align with view. So each time you play your game scene, you'll actually have that same kind of view. So that's just by the way. So a prefab is going to help us become much more memory efficient. That's the key advantage of a prefab. With a prefab, you can create a game object over and over again. You can spawn game objects as a specific point in time, and it becomes much more memory efficient, and it prevents you from having this cloggy and clunky system of working. So let's go ahead and get rid of this. So I'll just select everything from here, and I'll leave the first set which we created. So one thing we can do in Unity is to nest game objects together. Basically, you can have a parent-child relationship with your game objects. So for instance, I could select the point light, the cube 1, cube 2, and the cube, and I'll drag all these to my game object. So basically what I'm doing is this. If I move the game object, I'll be moving all my components together, all the other game objects, and I'll assign to the parent game object, and we're going to call this parent object. So this is our parent game object, but still, if we wanted to create a copy, we could just duplicate this and we actually have another set of parent game object. This seems to be fine, but when it also comes to memory, this is not the best way of doing things, so I'll just go ahead and delete that. So one of the best ways to do that in Unity is to use what is called prefabs. So right here, to create a prefab, you just drag your game objects or group of game objects into your project. And it's also nice to have a prefab folder. By the way, I'm using the 1-column layout. So if I switch this to 2-column layout, it should take us to the default Unity layout, and we'll just use this layout. So right here in my assets folder, I'll just right click and create a new folder. And I'll just call that folder prefabs. So now I've created that prefab folder. I'll just drag our parent game object and drag it into this prefab folder. And once that object becomes blue, this is actually seen as a prefab. Now what you can do is to quickly, you can get rid of that prefab, and you can always have copies of that prefab like so. Right, so let's go ahead and also delete that. So what we can do is to instantiate a prefab during runtime. Basically, if our scene is empty, it has no draw calls, we're not drawing any game object, we can actually instantiate that prefab when that game object is running. So let's go ahead and see how we could do that. So first thing I like to do is to create an empty game object. So now that I have that empty game object, I'm just going to call it empty. And what I'm also going to do is to create a C# script. So let's go to our assets and let's go to our scripts. And right here, I'll just create a new C# script and I'll call that prefab script. And I'll just open up that prefab script. So now that we have our prefab script, to actually create a prefab, all we simply need to do is to instantiate that prefab. So I'll create a access to a public game object. So I'll just do public game object. Let's just call that awesome prefab. And since this is public, we won't actually have access to this right now. We'll have access to it when we actually pass in that object. So let's go ahead and save our scene. So to instantiate a prefab in our stat method, let me just go ahead and create a method. So I'll just say void create prefab, just like that. And then right here in our start method, let's pass in our create prefab right there, and we'll write the script to create this prefab. So to do so, we're going to say instantiate I think this is instantiate like so, and then we'll pass in our awesome prefab. And then we need to pass in a transform for our game object. So I'm going to create a new vector tree. And I'll just pass in everything at 0, 0, 0. And then also for our rotation, we want a 0 rotation. So I'll use a quaternion dot identity for, and we'll just pass in dot identity. So now that we've done that, let's go ahead and save our scene, our prefab scene project, and let's go back to our game object. And right here where we have our empty game object, let's drag the prefab script and assign that prefab script right here. And now you can see it's telling us it needs a game object right here. So let's go to our prefabs folder. And let's just drag this and just place our game object right here. And I'm actually getting an error right here. So what's happening? Okay, so I have spelled this wrong. So let me go ahead and just spell this properly. So it's qua. I think it's quaternion. I think that's the spelling of quaternion. So let's just go ahead and jump back to Unity and see if this error is going to go away. Alright, it went away. So let's go ahead and we've passed our script and added our prefab. So let's go ahead and play our scene. And you can see we're instantiating that prefab, and it says right here that this is a clone for that prefab. And you can see we actually have these game objects attached to this prefab. So that's one way of actually instantiating a game object at runtime. So if we wanted to change this and instantiate this game object at another position, we can just go in our script and say for our y-axis, we could set this to say 3.0, and we'll just save that. And if we go back to our scene, and actually play our scene, if we actually go back to our game object and look at our transform, we can see that this object has been transformed in this point. So maybe we're not seeing that. So if we actually go to our scene and we can turn on the grid and actually look at it from another angle, we can actually see that we have kind of lifted up like 3 units from the top, just like that. So that's one way we can instantiate prefabs. We can even instantiate prefabs when we click at a mouse position. For instance, we could click at any point and instantiate a prefab. So some other uses of the prefab include, putting characters, or your player. You can put your player in different positions. You can launch projectiles and all sort of stuff. Thank you very much, guys, for watching, and see you in the next lesson.